The lights in the assembly chamber turned white the moment Eleanor Quinn stood to speak, and that white light made her look smaller, not bigger, as if the room itself wanted to erase her before she opened her mouth. I sat 2 rows behind her, the recorder warm against my knee, watching the translation lights blink above 300 alien delegates who had never expected a species this young to walk in carrying proof. Eleanor lifted the data crystal so the whole chamber could see it. Inside it was a voice, a Vathol trade envoy, recorded in his own words, admitting that the meteor strike on Kesser's Reach had never been a meteor at all. 312 human colonists were dead because a trade route ran 6 light-years too close to land the Vathol wanted for themselves. She read the first line of the confession into the record. Her voice did not shake. I had watched her practice that steadiness for 6 months in a cabin mirror on the transport ship, and I never once told her I knew. I watched the assembly speaker instead. His 4 eyes drifted to the mute relay before she finished her second sentence, and his clawed hand hovered over the panel the way a man hovers over a light switch in a room he is not sure he wants lit. The feed did not cut clean. That detail still sits wrong in my chest, even now. It kept broadcasting empty air for 3 full seconds, as if the silence itself was part of the procedure, official and rehearsed, something written into a rule book nobody had let us read. Then 2 Vathol enforcers in dull gray armor came through a side door that was not on any floor plan we had been given, and they walked toward Eleanor the way men walk toward furniture they intend to move. I stood up. Nobody else did. 300 delegates from 40 different worlds, and not one of them so much as turned their head. I understood then, faster than I wanted to, that this had happened before, to other species, in other chambers, and every single one of them had learned the lesson the room was now trying to teach us. Stay seated, and it will not happen to you. Eleanor did not fight them. She set the data crystal down on the podium, very carefully, like she was leaving it for someone to find later, and she let them take her by the arms. I moved down the aisle. A guard I had not seen stepped into my path, and I said her name, just her name, twice, because it was the only weapon I had left. She turned her head as they pulled her through the side door. She found me in the crowd. She did not look frightened. She looked like a woman doing arithmetic, fast, the kind of math you do when you already know the answer and you are only checking your work. She mouthed one word at me, run. I am not going to describe what happened in that corridor. I have told this story more times than I can count, in more rooms than I can count, and that is the one piece I keep. It is mine. What I will say is this. She did not get to finish her sentence, and neither did I, because somewhere between the side door and the loading dock, the only thing left in my hands was the recorder, still warm, still running, tucked under my coat like a small animal I was smuggling out of a burning building. I do not remember choosing to run. I remember my legs deciding for me, the way you decide to pull your hand off a hot stove before your mind has finished registering the heat. The corridor walls were a pale green I had never seen on any human station, the kind of color a species chooses when it has stopped trying to make anything feel like home. I ran past windows that looked out onto a docking ring crowded with ships from 40 governments, none of which would help me, all of which would later say they never saw a thing. Behind me, boots. Not fast. That was the part that frightened me more than anything else. The enforcers were not chasing me at a run. They were walking, unhurried, because they did not believe I was worth the energy of urgency. I was an aide, a note-taker, a girl who carried bags and recorders and made sure the messenger's coffee was hot before sessions. In their accounting, I did not matter enough to chase properly. That mistake bought me the dock. Our shuttle, the Solace, sat at berth 19, a small gray transport with Earth's old blue circle still painted faded on the hull, because nobody back home had thought to update the markings of a ship that was only ever supposed to carry diplomats and paperwork. I came through the airlock so fast I clipped my shoulder on the frame, and I did not feel it until hours later, when the bruise had already turned the color of a storm. Owen Bates was in the pilot's seat, running a pre-flight check he had no reason to be running, because we were not scheduled to leave for another 6 hours. I have asked him since why he had the engines half warm already. He has never given me a straight answer. I think some part of him already knew, the way pilots sometimes know weather before the instruments do. He took one look at my face and did not ask a single question. He just said get in, and started flipping switches faster than I had ever seen him move. I told him what happened in 11 words, because that was all I had air for. He did not say anything back. His jaw just tightened, and his hands kept working. The dock control tower tried to hold us. A voice came over the comm, polite, almost bored, informing us that our departure window had not yet opened, and that unauthorized undocking would result in diplomatic consequences. Owen looked at the comm panel for exactly 1 second. Then he said something I will not repeat for the recording, and he pulled us out of the berth without clearance. The Vathol patrol ships scrambled fast, 3 of them, sleek and dark, peeling off the docking ring like wasps coming off a disturbed nest, and I remember pressing my hand flat against the hull beside my seat, as if I could feel the engines working through the metal, as if that would somehow make them work harder. Owen threaded us between 2 cargo freighters with a gap I would have sworn was too narrow for anything bigger than a shuttle, and for 1 full second the proximity alarm screamed so loud I thought it would shake the recorder out of my coat. We cleared the docking ring. The stars opened up in front of us, and behind us, 3 Vathol patrol ships fell into pursuit formation, close enough that I could see the heat shimmer off their forward weapons charging. Owen's voice was flat and steady, the voice of a man who had decided panic was a luxury he could not afford yet. He said one sentence, "Hold on to something." I held on to the recorder instead, both hands wrapped around it like it was the only solid thing left in the universe, and I felt the solace lurch into a jump that threw my stomach somewhere behind my spine, and the stars smeared into long white lines, and the patrol ship's weapons fire, the first shots ever fired at a human vessel by the Vathol assembly, passed through the space where we had been half a heartbeat too late. When the stars snapped back into focus, we were alone in open dark, 11 light-years from the chamber where Eleanor Quinn had been taken through a door that was not on any floor plan, and I realized I was still holding my breath, the way you hold your breath after a fall, checking which parts of you still work. I looked down at the recorder. The little red light was still on, still running, still listening to nothing but the hum of the engines and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I pressed my thumb against the casing, hard enough to hurt, and I made myself a promise that I have kept every single day since. Whatever was on this recording, whatever truth had gotten her taken through that door, the entire human species was going to hear it, even if I had to fly it home myself. Owen did not let himself relax. He kept his eyes on the long-range scanner, one hand still on the controls, and when I finally asked if we had lost them, he gave me an answer I did not want. He said the Vathol did not need to chase us through open space. They only needed to reach a relay station before we did, and report a stolen diplomatic shuttle, and every system between here and Earth would treat us like criminals instead of survivors. I had not thought of it that way. I had been so focused on the ship behind us that I had not noticed the trap waiting ahead. Owen pulled up a star chart and traced a route with one finger, a route that avoided every relay station the Vathol had influence over, even the ones that flew neutral flags. It added 4 days to our journey. He did not ask my opinion. He simply set the course and let the engines settle into a long, steady burn. I sat with the recorder in my lap for a long time after that, watching the small red light blink, listening to nothing on it but engine noise and my own breathing from the corridor. I told myself I would listen to the whole thing once we were safe. I never got the chance to feel safe enough to try. Instead, I found myself doing something smaller. I straightened the cabin. I folded the blanket that had fallen off the spare seat. I lined up the data tablets on the small fold-out table until their edges matched perfectly, even though none of it mattered, even though the ship could have been struck out of the sky a second later, and the tablets would have meant nothing at all. Owen noticed. He did not say anything about it. He just reached over, after a while, and put his hand flat on top of mine, the way you steady a glass that is about to tip, and he left it there until my hands stopped moving on their own. Outside the viewport, the stars sat still and indifferent, the way they always do, no matter what has just been taken from you, and I understood for the first time that the silence behind us was not over. It had only changed shape. It was waiting for us at the next relay station, and the one after that, all the way home. The first relay station we passed showed no warning lights. The second one did. Owen caught it on the long-range scanner 3 hours out, a quiet flag buried in the traffic control broadcast, a request for any vessel matching our hull signature to hold position and prepare for boarding. He did not say a word. He simply banked the Solace 40 degrees off our planned course, and killed every non-essential system, including the cabin heat, so that we would show up on their sensors as nothing more than drifting debris. I sat wrapped in the folded blanket, watching my own breath turn faint and visible in the cold cabin air, and I thought about how strange it was that the safest thing a person could do, sometimes, was disappear. We drifted for 6 hours. 6 hours of silence so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and somewhere in the third hour I finally let myself cry, quietly, with my face turned toward the viewport so Owen would not have to watch it happen. He let me. He did not offer comfort, because there was none to offer that would have meant anything, and I have always respected him for understanding that. When the relay station's sensors finally swept past us and moved on, Owen brought the systems back online one at a time, slow and careful, like a man easing a sleeping child back into a crib. 11 days. That is how long it took to cross the dark between that chamber and home, and I have never told anyone exactly how I spent them. because most of it was not dramatic at all, was small. It was folding the same blanket over and over. It was replaying, in my head, not the corridor, but the sound of Eleanor's voice in committee meetings, the way she used to hum old songs under her breath while reading briefing papers, the exact way she took her coffee, which was badly, with too much sugar, in a chipped mug she refused to replace because her father had given it to her. I did not listen to the recording, not once, in 11 days. I told myself it was because I needed to save the battery. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I was afraid that if I heard her voice end mid-sentence one more time, something in me would end with it. I had worked for Eleanor for just under 2 years by then, ever since she pulled my application out of a stack of overqualified candidates because, as she told me on my first day, I was the only one who had bothered to read the actual mission charter instead of the public summary. She did not hire me because I was impressive. She hired me because I asked the right question in the interview, which was simply why Earth had waited so long to send anyone to the assembly at all, and she liked that I had not been satisfied with the easy answer her predecessor had always given. In 2 years, she taught me more about patience than my entire education before that had managed. She taught me that the right word, placed correctly, could do more work than an hour of shouting. And she taught me, without ever saying it directly, that carrying someone else's message faithfully was its own kind of courage, quieter than the courage of standing at the podium, but no less necessary. I had never once imagined that the lesson would end with me carrying her last message instead of her next one. On the 9th day, Owen finally asked me what was on the recorder. I told him I did not know for certain, only what Eleanor had told me before the session began, that it proved Kesser's reach was an act of aggression dressed up as an accident, and that there was something else on the data crystal too, something she had called insurance, though she had never explained what she meant. He asked if I thought that was why they had silenced her. I said I did not think the confession alone was worth taking a sitting messenger through an unmarked door. Governments survive embarrassment all the time. Something about the insurance frightened them more. We did not talk about it again until we reached Earth space. I will remember the approach to Earth for the rest of my life. The way the planet swelled from a blue point of light into a full curved horizon, familiar and impossible at the same time, like a word you have said so many times it stops sounding real. Lunar traffic control flagged us the moment we crossed the outer marker, not as a stolen vessel, but as a priority contact, because somewhere in those 11 days, word of what happened in the assembly chamber had already reached home through other channels, garbled and partial, enough to make every official on the comm sound frightened. We were met at the lunar docks not by customs officers, but by a full security escort, and I was taken, still wearing the same coat I had run in, directly into a briefing room beneath the Earth Defense Command compound, where I sat across a table from people whose faces I recognized from news broadcasts and had never once expected to meet. General Daniel Pierce was younger than I expected, with the kind of stillness in his hands that I had only ever seen before in surgeons and snipers. He did not ask me how I was feeling. He asked me, very simply, to play the recording. I had carried it for 11 days without listening to it, and now I had to play it in front of 6 strangers in uniforms, and I remember my hands shaking for the first time since the chamber as I set the recorder on the table between us. The first sound was my own breathing, ragged, from the corridor, then her voice, calm, reading the opening line of the confession into the assembly record, then the 3 seconds of dead air where the feed should have cut and did not. Then footsteps, then her voice again, lower now, urgent, speaking fast into a recorder she must have palmed without my noticing, words meant for whoever found this after she could no longer speak for herself. She named the trade envoy. She named 2 members of the Vathol High Council who had personally authorized the strike on Kesser's Reach. And then she said something that made the room go so quiet I could hear the building's ventilation system humming through the walls. She said Kesser's Reach was not the first colony erased and blamed on accident. It was the 11th, 11 young species across 3 centuries, quietly removed from contested territory and recorded in Vathol archives as natural disasters, because the assembly's stability depended on no species ever realizing how often this had been done, and how easily. The recording ended there. Footsteps. Closer. Then nothing. Nobody in that room spoke for almost a full minute. A woman near the end of the table finally moved first. She introduced herself as Ivy Sutherland, head of a small intelligence division I had never heard of before that night, and she asked to keep the recorder, not to copy it, but to study the background noise itself, the footsteps, the door mechanisms, anything that might tell her where on that station Eleanor had actually been taken. I did not want to let it go. I had carried it 11 days through cold and silence, and handing it across that table felt like setting down something I had promised to carry forever. Ivy must have seen that on my face, because she told me, very plainly, that she understood, and that she would return it to me herself once her team had finished, and somehow that small promise from a stranger was enough. General Pierce was the one who finally broke the silence, and what he said was not a question. He said that if 11 species had been silenced quietly enough that none of them had ever raised an alarm the rest of the assembly heard, then humanity's choice was simple. We could become the 12th name on that list, filed away as another accident. Or we could become the first species in 3 centuries to refuse to disappear quietly. The Security Council session that followed lasted just over 4 hours, and I was permitted to stay for all of it, sitting against the back wall with a cup of coffee I never drank, watching people who governed a planet of 11 billion lives decide, almost without raising their voices, that the only acceptable answer to what had happened was total mobilization. 3 of those hours were spent simply watching the recording on a loop, in silence, the way you sit with a body before the funeral, not because anyone needed to hear it twice, but because nobody could quite make themselves move on from it the first time. The 4th hour was logistics, and logistics, it turns out, can sound almost gentle when spoken in the right voice. Shipyard capacity, reservist call-ups, diplomatic notifications to allied stations that would need to choose, very quickly, which side of this they intended to stand on. Not everyone in that room agreed without question. An older councilwoman, near the head of the table, argued that total mobilization would leave Earth's home defenses thin for years, and that a measured response, sanctions and a formal grievance filed before the assembly, might achieve justice without risking the planet itself. Pierce listened to every word of it without interrupting, the way a man listens when he respects the person speaking even though he has already made up his mind. When she finished, he asked her only one question. He asked what kind of grievance she imagined the assembly would hear from a species whose own messenger had just been silenced for filing one. The councilwoman did not have an answer. Nobody did. The vote that followed was not close. Near the end of that 4th hour, Pierce turned to me directly for the first time since the recording had played, and asked what I intended to do now. I had not thought about it. I had spent 11 days simply trying to survive the distance between that chamber and home, and I had not allowed myself to imagine anything beyond it. I told him the truth, which was that I did not know how to do anything except carry messages for people braver than me. He said that was, in his experience, a rarer skill than I understood, and he asked if I would be willing to keep carrying them, this time for a fleet instead of a single messenger. I said yes before I had even finished thinking it through, because some decisions, I have learned, are not made in the mind at all. They are made somewhere lower down, somewhere that already knew the answer before the question was even asked. By the time I was released from that compound, well past midnight, the orbital shipyards above the far side of the moon were already running triple shifts, floodlights burning bright enough to be visible from the surface. And somewhere in that light, before the first hull plate of the first new warship had even been welded into place, someone had already painted a name along its bow. I did not choose that name, I do not know who did, but I stood on an observation deck at 3 in the morning, still wearing the coat I had run in 11 days and 1 star system ago, and I watched the letters take shape under the floodlights, and I understood, in a way I had not allowed myself to feel until that exact moment, that Eleanor Quinn was no longer only a person I had lost. She had become the reason an entire planet was about to go to war. A young officer found me on that observation deck not long after, introduced herself as Grace Holloway, and told me she had been assigned to walk me through enlistment processing in the morning, since General Pierce had apparently decided I would be useful in a communications role aboard the new flagship. She did not treat me like a grieving aide who had wandered into a war by accident. She treated me like someone already on her crew, and she handed me a cup of real coffee instead of the vending machine kind, and for reasons I still cannot fully explain, that small kindness was the thing that finally let me sleep that night. I did not dream of the corridor. I dreamed, oddly, of Eleanor's chipped mug, sitting alone on a shelf back on Earth, the coffee in it long since gone cold, waiting for a hand that was never coming back to lift it again. When I woke, the shipyards were still burning bright through my window, and somewhere above the moon, the Vanguard had already begun to take shape. 6 months is not enough time to build a war fleet. I learned that the hard way, standing on the flight deck of the Vanguard while engineers in heavy suits welded the last external plating into place around us, the noise so constant that conversations had to be shouted directly into another person's ear to be heard at all. 6 months was, however, exactly the amount of time we had, because Ivy Sutherland's intelligence division had confirmed something Earth Defense Command could not afford to ignore. The Vathol High Council knew we were coming. 11 silent species across 3 centuries had taught them how young civilizations usually responded to loss, and that response was rarely war. It was grief, followed by paperwork, followed by quiet acceptance. They were not prepared for a species that would build an entire fleet inside half a year out of nothing but anger and moonrock. I spent those 6 months learning a new language, Not literally, though I did pick up enough Vathol vocabulary to recognize threat postures in their fleet communications. I mean the language of a warship, the difference between a pressure warning and a hull breach alarm, the particular hum an engine makes 1 second before it overheats, the specific silence that falls across a bridge crew right before a commander gives an order nobody wants to hear. Noah Fairweather taught me most of it, in the long hours we spent together in the lower engineering decks while he rebuilt half the Vanguard's communication relays with his own hands, because the factory-installed versions kept failing under stress testing. Noah was the kind of engineer who talked to machines the way other people talk to pets, low and constant and slightly absurd, and somehow that constant murmuring voice in the background became the thing that made the engineering deck feel less like a war room and more like a place I could survive. Caleb Reyes ran combat drills for the non-military crew, which included me, and on my first day he told the room, without any humor at all, that half of us would freeze the first time live weapons fire actually came at our hull, and that freezing was not a failure of character, it was biology, and the only cure for it was repetition until your body learned a different reflex than fear. He drilled us until the alarm sequences became something my hands responded to before my mind had finished processing the sound, and I am alive today, in no small part. Because of those drills, Grace Holloway became something closer to a friend than I expected to find in the middle of a war buildup. She had a habit of bringing real coffee to the communications deck at odd hours, the same way she had that first night on the observation platform, and she had an even stranger habit of humming under her breath while running diagnostic checks, old songs from before either of us were born. Songs I never told her reminded me of Eleanor, because some things are better kept than spoken. General Pierce visited the Vanguard twice during construction, and both times he found a reason to speak with me directly, never for long, never about anything that felt official. The first time, he asked how I was sleeping. The second time, he simply asked if I had listened to the recording all the way through yet. I told him I had, once, alone, late at night, and that I did not think I would do it again, not because I could not bear it, but because I already knew every word of it by heart, and some recordings are meant to be carried rather than replayed. The day the Vanguard left dry dock for the first time, I stood at my communications station and watched Earth fall away behind us through the rear viewport, blue and small and entirely unaware, most of its 11 billion people, of exactly how close the fleet now forming around their planet had come to never existing at all. We were not alone. Behind the Vanguard came 11 other warships, built in the same 6 frantic months, crewed by reservists and volunteers, and a handful of veteran officers pulled out of retirement, because the war had arrived faster than anyone's training pipeline could keep pace with. Pierce called it the First Fleet, not because he expected it to be the last, but because he wanted everyone aboard to understand, from the very first day, that there would be a second, and likely a third. Our first contact with the Vathol came 11 days into deployment, in a system we had no prior claim to, and no particular reason to defend, except that Vathol scout ships had been detected there, watching, the way a predator watches before deciding whether prey is worth the effort of a chase. I was at my station when the proximity alarm went off, a sound I had heard in drills 100 times, and had never once mistaken for the real thing, until the exact moment it happened. My hands moved before my thoughts caught up, exactly the way Caleb had promised they would, pulling up the communications relay and opening the fleet-wide channel, without needing to think through the sequence at all. 3 Vathol scout vessels had decloaked at the edge of the system, sleek and dark, the same silhouette I remembered from the docking ring 11 days and 1 war ago. They had not expected to find a full fleet waiting for them. Scout ships are built to watch and report, not to fight, and for one long moment, on the bridge of the Vanguard, nobody fired at all, both sides simply staring across the dark at each other, weapons charged, neither willing to be the one who made the first mistake of the war. Pierce broke that silence himself. He ordered a single warning shot across the lead scout's bow, close enough to register on their sensors as a deliberate message, far enough to avoid striking the hull. It was, I think, the single most restrained decision made by anyone in that entire war, and it bought us exactly 4 seconds before the scout ships opened fire anyway. The Vanguard shuddered as the first impact struck our forward shielding, and I felt the deck plating vibrate up through my boots and into my teeth, a sensation I have never been able to properly describe to anyone who was not aboard a warship the first time it took live fire. Alarms layered over alarms. Grace's voice cut through my headset, calm and fast, relaying shield integrity numbers I barely had time to process before Caleb's voice followed, calling out targeting solutions to the gunnery deck below us. I did exactly what I had been trained to do. I opened every channel between our ships and kept them open, relaying Pierce's orders to all 11 vessels of the First Fleet in the same breath he gave them, my voice steadier than I had any right to expect, because somewhere in those 6 months of drills, My body had learned to perform calm even when the rest of me had not caught up yet. The battle lasted 4 minutes. I know that only because the ship's log told me afterward, because in the moment itself, time did not behave the way it normally does. It came apart into small, sharp pieces, the flash of a Vathol scout breaking apart under concentrated fire from 3 of our cruisers, the sound of Noah's voice over an open engineering channel reporting a hull breach on Deck 6 that he was already moving to seal, the strange, specific silence that fell over the bridge in the half-second after the last enemy vessel either fled or was destroyed. 2 of the 3 Vathol scouts were destroyed outright. The third broke away and ran, jumping out of the system before our pursuit ships could close the distance, carrying with it, we would later learn, the first confirmed report back to the Vathol High Council that Earth had not only survived the silencing of its messenger, but had built a fleet capable of meeting them in open battle within half a year. We had not won without cost. The Solace, the very shuttle Owen had flown me home in 11 days and 1 lifetime ago, had been pressed into service as a forward scout for the battle, and a stray hit from the 3rd scout vessel had clipped her engine housing badly enough that Owen brought her back to the Vanguard trailing smoke and venting atmosphere from a hull breach he had no business surviving. I was on the flight deck when they pulled him out of the cockpit, his arm bent at an angle that made my stomach turn before any part of my mind had time to process what I was looking at, and I remember gripping the edge of the deck railing hard enough to leave marks on my palm, watching the medical team work, refusing to let myself look away, because some part of me had decided that if I looked away, it would mean I had stopped believing he would be all right. He was all right. 3 broken ribs, a fractured arm, a concussion that kept him grounded for 2 weeks, and a scar along his jaw that he would later claim, with a perfectly straight face, made him more attractive, an opinion Grace disputed loudly and often for the rest of the campaign. That night, after the medical bay had gone quiet and Owen had finally been allowed to sleep, I found myself back at my communications station, alone, running my fingers along the edge of the console the way I used to run them along the casing of Eleanor's recorder, and I understood, fully, for the first time, exactly what kind of war we had started. It was not going to end in 4 minutes, and it was not going to end with 3 scout ships. It was only beginning, and somewhere out past the dark, the Vathol High Council was beginning to understand exactly the same thing. The cost of those 4 minutes did not end with Owen. 7 crew members aboard the cruiser Halcyon were lost when a secondary explosion tore through their portside weapons bay, and I did not know any of their names before that night, and I have not forgotten a single one of them since. Pierce read the names aloud over the fleet-wide channel the next morning, slowly, without any rehearsed comfort attached to them, and I stood at my station and listened to 11 warships go completely silent for the length of that reading, every comm channel open and quiet at once, which is its own particular kind of sound, the sound of an entire fleet holding its breath together. Those 2 weeks of Owen's recovery were strange ones aboard the Vanguard, the kind of strange that only follows a first taste of real loss. Caleb doubled the drill schedule rather than easing it, and at first I thought it was simply discipline, until I noticed that he ran every single drill himself, alongside the rest of us, sweating through the same alarm sequences over and over, and I understood, eventually, that he was not drilling us so much as he was keeping his own hands busy enough that they did not have time to remember the 7 names from the Halcyon too clearly. Owen hated being grounded more than he hated almost anything else in his life, and he spent his medical leave finding small, technically permitted ways to make himself useful anyway, reviewing flight logs from his cot in the medical bay, arguing with Noah over comm channel routing he had no business having an opinion on, charming the medical staff into letting him out a full day earlier than his chart recommended. When he finally returned to the flight deck, the entire bridge crew applauded, which embarrassed him more than the broken ribs ever had, and Grace presented him with a mug of real coffee and a single word written on a data slate in block letters that simply said alive, which became, without either of them planning it, a quiet ritual the 2 of them kept for the rest of the war. A single word slipped to each other after every battle that confirmed, without needing anything more elaborate, that the other had survived it. That ritual outlasted the war itself, in the end, though I would not understand how much it would come to mean until much later. Afterward, Pierce called a small group of us into the briefing room beneath the bridge, myself included, though I still did not fully understand why he kept including me in rooms meant for officers far above my rank. Ivy Sutherland was there too, patched in from Earth over a secure relay, her face tired in a way that suggested she had not slept properly since the night she had taken the recorder from my hands. She told us the captured Vathol communications fragment recovered from the wreckage of the 2nd destroyed scout had revealed something her team had not expected. The scouts had not simply been watching the border, they had been specifically searching for the Vanguard by name, which meant the Vathol High Council already knew far more about our fleet than a routine reconnaissance mission should have uncovered. Pierce asked the obvious question. He asked how. Ivy did not have a full answer yet, only a fragment of one. A single phrase repeated twice in the intercepted communication that her translation algorithms struggled to render cleanly into anything but an approximation. The closest she could offer was the source remains secure, which told us almost nothing and everything at once. Someone, somewhere, was passing information to the Vathol that they should not have had access to. And until that leak was found, every move the First Fleet made was being watched before we had finished deciding to make it. I left that briefing with a feeling I had not expected to carry this far into the war, a feeling closer to the one I had in the assembly chamber than anything I had felt since. The sense of being watched by something that had already decided how the story was going to end, and was simply waiting for the rest of us to catch up. Grace found me afterward on the observation deck, the same spot where she had handed me coffee on the night the Vanguard first took shape, and she did not ask what was wrong, because she already knew. She simply stood beside me, watching the stars, and after a long while she said something I have carried with me through every battle since. She said that the Vathol had spent 3 centuries learning exactly how to make young species feel small and alone in the dark. She said the only thing we could do differently from the 11 species before us was refuse to feel that way, even when every fact in front of us said we should. I did not feel less afraid after she said it, but I felt, for the first time since the chamber, that the fear and I were no longer alone with each other, and somehow that was enough to let me sleep. 3 days later, new orders came down from Earth Defense Command, carried personally by a courier ship rather than transmitted over any relay, because nobody trusted the relays anymore. The First Fleet was to push deeper into contested space, toward a system called Mareth Vale, where Ivy's division believed the leak we had detected was being routed through. It was not going to be a battle for territory. It was going to be a hunt for whoever, on our own side, had decided that Earth's war was worth selling. I did not know it yet, standing on that observation deck with Grace's words still settling into me, but Mareth Vale was where I would learn exactly how deep the silence around Kesser's Reach truly went, and exactly how far someone in our own fleet was willing to go to keep it buried. Mareth Vale was not a system anyone back on Earth had ever heard of before the war, a quiet cluster of rock and ice with no habitable worlds and no resources worth the name, the kind of place a species only visits if it is hiding something or looking for something hidden. We approached it slow, engines running cold, every ship in the First Fleet under strict communication silence on Ivy's orders, because if the leak she suspected was real, then any transmission we sent might already be reaching the wrong ears before it reached the right ones. I spent that approach in the communications deck beside Grace, both of us monitoring frequencies for anything out of place, and somewhere around the 2nd hour of silence, I found myself doing the same thing I had done on the Solace 11 days into our flight home from the assembly. I straightened things. I checked the same diagnostic readout 3 times, not because it needed checking, but because my hands needed something to do that was not waiting. Ivy found what she was looking for 4 hours after we entered the system, a small unmanned relay station drifting in a wide, lazy orbit around the largest of Mareth Vale's frozen moons, disguised well enough that 3 previous surveys of the system had logged it as debris and moved on. Her team's deeper scan told a different story. The relay was active, drawing power, and broadcasting on a frequency band that matched, almost exactly, the encrypted channel used by Earth Defense Command's own fleet-wide communications array. Pierce ordered a boarding team rather than a strike, because Ivy was insistent that destroying the relay outright would tell us nothing about how long it had been there or who had built it. Caleb led the team himself, and I was not meant to be part of it, but Ivy specifically requested my presence, because the relay's internal logs, once cracked, were recorded in a language structure that did not match standard Vathol communication protocols at all. She wanted someone who had spent months listening to alien speech patterns in the assembly chamber, and apparently, somewhere in those months of listening to Eleanor's briefings, I had absorbed more than I realized. What we found aboard that relay changed the shape of the entire war. The station was old. Decades old, according to the wear patterns on its internal components. Far older than the conflict over Kesser's Reach. Far older than Eleanor's appointment as messenger. Far older than most of the crew standing in that cramped, frozen interior with our breath fogging in suits not designed for comfort. It had been quietly monitoring human communications since long before any of us had known the Vathol existed as more than a name in a long list of assembly member species. Ivy's working theory, confirmed within hours by the data we extracted, was almost worse than any single act of sabotage could have been. There was no individual traitor feeding our fleet's positions to the enemy. There did not need to be one. The Vathol had simply been listening to humanity, patiently, for years, the same way they had apparently listened to 10 other young species before deciding which of their resources were worth claiming, and which lives were cheap enough to erase quietly. Kesser's Reach had not been a sudden act of greed. It had been the calculated result of decades of quiet observation, a decision made only once the listeners were confident that humanity, like the 11 species before us, would respond with grief and paperwork rather than a fleet. They had simply miscalculated, for the first time in 3 centuries, exactly how wrong that confidence could turn out to be. I will admit that standing inside that frozen relay station, hearing Ivy explain all of this in a voice gone flat with exhaustion, I did not feel triumphant about being right. I felt something closer to grief, a delayed and complicated grief, because it meant Eleanor's death had not been about silencing one inconvenient confession. It had been about silencing the first crack in a pattern the Vaethol had spent 3 centuries protecting, and she had found that crack months before any of the rest of us understood what she was looking at. The insurance she had spoken of in the recording was not a single secret. It was this: the proof that an entire species' rise and fall had been quietly engineered, monitored, and erased, over and over, by a council that called itself the Keeper of Galactic Order, while operating as something closer to a long, patient predator. Caleb's team secured the relay and prepared it for transport back to Earth, and it was during that final sweep of the station that we found the part of the discovery I have never been able to speak about easily, even now. A secondary archive, hidden deeper in the relay's storage core, contained partial recordings from several of the other 10 silenced species, fragments of voices speaking languages none of us recognized, tones that needed no translation at all to understand as fear, as pleading, as the same desperate attempt to be heard that Eleanor had made in her final recorded words. Some of those fragments were decades old. One, according to the station's internal timestamp, was nearly a century old. 11 species, the recording had said. Standing in that frozen room, listening to the 11th and oldest of those silenced voices crackle through a translator that could only render fragments of meaning, I understood that we were not fighting a war over one colony, or one messenger, or even one species. We were fighting to be the first voice in 3 centuries that the Vaethol High Council would not manage to erase. We did not get to leave Marith Vale quietly. The proximity alarm tore through the relay station less than 20 minutes after Caleb's team had finished extracting the archive, and over the comm I heard Grace's voice from the Vanguard, stripped of its usual calm, calling out a contact that none of our long-range scans had given us any warning of at all. A Vaethol strike force had dropped out of jump space directly on top of the system, 6 warships heavier than anything we had faced in the first engagement, and their formation was not the cautious, watching posture of a scout fleet. It was the formation of a force that had come to erase a problem before it could spread any further. Pierce's voice cut across the fleet channel with a steadiness that I have never fully understood how he managed to find in that moment. He ordered immediate evacuation of the boarding team and full defensive formation around the relay station, because the archive aboard it was now worth more to the survival of 11 other species than any single ship in our fleet, including the Vanguard itself. Getting Caleb's team off that frozen station was its own small war. The transport shuttle's docking clamp jammed on the first attempt, and I listened over an open channel as Noah, patched in from engineering, talked Caleb's team through a manual release sequence with a calm, constant stream of instruction that reminded me, even in that moment, of the way he used to murmur to broken machinery in the lower decks, low and steady, and entirely unwilling to panic on anyone else's behalf. The clamp released with 12 seconds to spare before the lead Vaethol cruiser came into weapons range. What followed was unlike the 4 minutes of our first battle in every way that mattered. This was not a skirmish with scout ships testing a border. This was 6 heavy warships bearing down on a fleet half their size, defending a target that could not be allowed to fall, and I felt the difference in my own body before my mind had fully processed the tactical reality, a kind of cold, narrow focus that made the communications deck feel smaller and louder at once. I opened every channel and held them open, the way I had trained to do, relaying Pierce's orders across all 11 ships of the First Fleet as fast as he could give them. Caleb's voice came through from the gunnery deck, calling targeting solutions. Grace's numbers, shield integrity dropping in increments I did not want to watch, scrolled past my station in a steady, unforgiving rhythm. Noah's updates from engineering grew shorter and more clipped with every passing minute, the particular shorthand of a man running out of slack to give. The Halcyon, already short-crewed and still carrying the scars of our first engagement, took the worst of the opening exchange, her shields failing entirely under concentrated fire from 2 of the Vaethol cruisers at once. I heard her captain's voice on the open channel, not panicked, simply reporting, the way Eleanor had reported into the assembly record with her voice not shaking, informing the fleet that the Halcyon would hold her position and draw fire as long as her hull lasted, so that the relay station behind her would not. She held for 6 minutes. I have the ship's log timestamps memorized, the way I have memorized every other number that mattered that day, because numbers are sometimes the only way grief lets itself be carried at all. Pierce did not let her sacrifice go to waste. He used those 6 minutes to bring the Vanguard and 3 other cruisers around in a flanking arc that the Vathol formation, built for a quick, decisive strike rather than a sustained engagement, had not anticipated from a fleet they still, even then, underestimated. The lead Vathol cruiser, the one that had nearly reached the relay station, took the full weight of our combined fire at close range, and I watched on the forward display as her hull buckled and split along seams that were never meant to take that kind of pressure, light spilling out of the wound in long, silent threads before the ship broke apart entirely. The remaining 5 Vathol vessels did what their entire species had apparently been doing for 3 centuries, when a plan stopped going quietly to plan. They retreated, fast and without coordination, leaving their own wounded ships behind in a way that told me, more clearly than any intelligence report could have, exactly how unprepared the Vathol High Council truly was for a fight that refused to stay contained and small. We had won. The relay station and its archive were intact, the data already transmitted to Earth before the battle had even fully ended, on Ivy's standing order that it should never again exist in only one place at one time. But the Halcyon did not survive the battle that bought us those 6 minutes, and I stood at my station long after the last enemy ship had vanished from our sensors, listening to the slow, deliberate roll call Pierce read out over the fleet-wide channel, names I had not yet learned attached to faces I would now never get the chance to meet, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that every step closer we came to the truth was going to cost something none of us could ever fully get back. Pierce relayed everything Ivy's team had recovered directly to Earth Defense Command, and within hours, for the first time since the war began, Earth opened a new channel, not to the Vathol Assembly, but to every other member species whose communications the relay station had also, it turned out, been quietly monitoring for years. We did not send threats. We sent the recordings themselves, raw and unedited, the 11 voices and Eleanor's 12th laid end to end, with no commentary attached, because by that point, none of us believed commentary was necessary. The response did not come quickly. Diplomacy between species, separated by light years, rarely does. But within a week, 3 smaller species who had quietly suffered their own unexplained losses along contested borders began asking questions inside the assembly chamber that the Vathol delegation could no longer answer with silence and a mute relay. The war was no longer something Earth was fighting alone in the dark. It was becoming something the entire assembly was finally being forced to look at directly, and the Vathol High Council, sensing the ground shifting beneath 3 centuries of careful quiet, responded the only way a predator responds when it realizes it has been seen. It stopped watching, and it began moving its full battle fleet toward Earth. The Vathol battle fleet reached the edge of Earth's solar system 19 days after Mareth Vale, and I learned about it the way I learned about most things by then, through Grace's voice in my headset, low and fast, telling me to get to my station before the general alert had even finished sounding through the ship. 43 vessels. That was the number Ivy's tracking division gave us, the largest single Vathol formation any recorded intelligence had ever logged, moving through open space in a slow, deliberate line that was not trying to hide itself at all. There was no scout fleet posture left in it, no caution, nothing of the predator that prefers to watch before it strikes. This was a council that had been seen, and had decided the only answer left to them was to remove the thing doing the seeing, completely and all at once. The first fleet had grown since Mareth Vale, 11 ships become 24. Reinforced by reservists and newly commissioned cruisers built in shipyards that had not stopped running triple shifts since the night the Vanguard first took shape. 24 ships against 43 was not a fight. Any tactical model gave us good odds in, and I remember standing at my station reading those numbers off a display that Pierce had ordered shown openly to the entire crew, because he believed, and said so plainly over the fleet-wide channel, that a crew who understood exactly what they were facing would fight harder than a crew kept comfortable with false confidence. I will not pretend I was not afraid. I had been afraid since the chamber, in one form or another, for longer than I had been anything else, and by that point in the war, fear had become less like an emergency, and more like a kind of weather I had learned to function inside of. What I had not expected, 3 hours before the Vathol fleet crossed into engagement range, was the sound that came over the long-range sensor array, a sound Grace described to me afterward as the strangest thing she had ever heard a tactical display make. A chorus of jump signatures opening one after another, dozens of them, none matching any ship registered to Earth Defense Command. For one full, terrible second, I thought we were caught between 2 enemy fleets. Then the identification codes began resolving on the display, one by one, and I understood that I was watching something none of us had truly believed would happen, not even after the recordings had been sent, not even after 3 smaller species had begun asking questions inside the assembly chamber that the Vathol delegation could no longer answer with silence. Allied ships. 11 of them from a species who called themselves the Orani, whose homeworld had quietly lost a border colony 40 years earlier, to what their own records had called a natural disaster, and who had spent those 40 years, it turned out, simply waiting for proof. 7 more from a smaller confederation near the galactic rim, who had lost an entire research outpost a century before any human had left their solar system. Others followed, smaller groups, individual ships, captains who had heard the recordings, and made a choice that their own governments had not yet been brave enough to make official. None of them owed Earth anything. We had been a member of the Assembly for less than 2 years, a young, loud, inconvenient species that had refused to disappear quietly, the way 11 others before us had. They came anyway, because Eleanor's 12 words at the end of that recording, the words about being thrown back 5 years, the words about an entire species' history quietly erased, had apparently meant something to people who had never met her and never would, in languages I could not speak, on worlds I had never seen. Pierce's voice, when he finally spoke to the combined fleet over an open channel that the Vathol could intercept and likely did, was not a speech. He simply stated, plainly, that the Vathol High Council had spent 3 centuries counting on every silenced species staying silent and alone. He said that ended today, and then he gave the order to hold formation, and the battle began. I have tried, many times since, to describe what it is like to coordinate communications across 35 Allied ships in the middle of the largest engagement humanity had ever taken part in, and I have never found language equal to it. It was not like the first battle, 4 sharp minutes of adrenaline and noise. It was not even like Mareth Vale, 6 minutes bought at the cost of a single ship's name added to a roll call. This lasted for nearly 2 hours, a long, grinding exchange that tested every system aboard the Vanguard, and every nerve in my own body, in ways I did not know either could survive. Noah's voice came through engineering channels less and less often as the battle wore on, each report shorter than the last, until near the end he simply stopped reporting numbers at all and started reporting only what still worked, which felt, in its own way, more honest than any percentage readout could have been. Caleb's gunnery deck took a direct hit 40 minutes into the engagement, and for 9 seconds, the longest 9 seconds of my entire life, his channel went completely dead before his voice came back through, rougher than before, reporting that the deck had held, that the crew had held, that he would update further once he had a hand free to do it with. Grace never left her station, not once, not even when a secondary explosion 3 decks below sent a shudder through the entire ship hard enough to throw half the bridge crew out of their seats. She simply braced one hand against her console, kept her headset in place with the other, and kept calling out shield numbers in a voice that did not waver, because by then we had all learned the same lesson Eleanor had taught us without ever meaning to, that a voice that refuses to shake is sometimes the only weapon a person has left. It was somewhere past the 90-minute mark, with the Vathol formation beginning, finally, to fracture under pressure from 2 directions at once, that Ivy's voice broke into the fleet channel from her secure relay on Earth, asking Pierce for permission to do something none of us had discussed in advance. She wanted to broadcast the full archive, live, across every assembly frequency her division could reach, not as evidence submitted quietly through proper channels the way Eleanor had tried to do it, but directly, in the middle of the battle itself, so that every delegate still sitting in that marble chamber would hear it, while the consequences of 3 centuries of silence were actively unfolding in real time above a planet they had expected to erase quietly. Pierce gave her 10 words of permission. He told her to let them hear exactly what they had spent 3 centuries refusing to. I do not know exactly what was broadcast into that chamber, because I was not there to witness the delegates' faces the way I had been the day Eleanor was taken through a door that was not on any floor plan we had been given. But Ivy told me afterward, and I believe her, that the recording opened with my own ragged breathing from that corridor, unedited, raw, followed by Eleanor's voice reading the very first line of the confession she had never been allowed to finish, and that for the first time in the recorded history of the assembly, the chamber's translation lights went completely dark, every delegate from every species choosing, all at once, to simply listen rather than process the words through a filter at all. The Vathol delegation, Ivy said, tried to invoke a procedural objection less than 30 seconds into the broadcast. The assembly speaker, the same one who had let his hand hover over the mute relay months earlier, did not move to silence it this time. He let it play, all of it. 11 voices and a 12th, end to end, exactly as we had sent it weeks before to species who had finally found the courage to act on what they heard. Above Earth, in the middle of the largest battle the solar system had ever witnessed, I felt something change in the Vathol formation before I understood why. 3 of their cruisers broke from the main line entirely, transmitting a surrender code on an open frequency, and Ivy later confirmed what we all suspected, that those three captains had been listening to the broadcast on their own internal channels and had simply decided, in the middle of an active battle, that they were no longer willing to die defending 3 centuries of silence they had not personally chosen. The remaining Vathol fleet did not surrender. Their commander, whose name I would only learn much later, pressed the attack with a kind of grim, committed fury that told me everything I needed to know about a person who understood the war was already lost, and intended to make it cost as much as possible anyway. The final 20 minutes of that battle are the hardest part of this story for me to put into words, because they were the part where I stopped being able to separate the tactical reality from the simple, animal fact of staying alive. The Vanguard took a direct hit to her port shielding that threw me out of my seat entirely, and I remember lying on the deck plating with alarms screaming around me, and the only thought clear enough to hold on to was the recorder, still in the inner pocket of a uniform that had replaced the coat I ran in months earlier, still there, still safe. Pierce brought the combined fleet around in a final coordinated strike that broke the Vathol commander's remaining formation entirely, and somewhere in the chaos of that last maneuver, the commander's own flagship, badly damaged and cut off from support, transmitted a final message to the assembly chamber rather than to us, a message Ivy would later describe only as an admission, brief and without apology, that the Council's 3 centuries of careful silence had ended the moment they decided one messenger's voice was worth more buried than answered. The battle ended not with a final shot, but with a long, ragged quiet that spread across the fleet channel as ship after ship reported holding position, holding their crews, holding, simply, on. I sat back down at my station with my hands shaking for the first time since the very beginning of this story, and I did not try to make them stop. I had earned the shaking. I let it happen. What came after the battle took longer than the battle itself, the way the truest endings usually do. The Vathol High Council did not survive its own assembly session intact. Delegates who had stayed silent for 3 centuries finally found language for what they had always known and never said, and within a month, the council that had ordered 11 species silenced and a 12th nearly joined them was dissolved entirely, replaced by an oversight body that included, for the first time in assembly history, representatives from every species the council had once erased. Earth was given a permanent seat, not as a courtesy this time, not as a young species being humored, but as the species that had refused to let 3 centuries of silence stand unanswered, and Eleanor Quinn's name was read into the assembly record on the day that seat was formally granted, not as a footnote, but as the opening line. I was asked to speak that day, in the same chamber, under the same white lights that had once made her look smaller than she was. I did not write a speech. I simply set the recorder down on the same podium where she had once placed the data crystal so carefully, like she was leaving it for someone to find, and I let her finish the sentence the assembly had cut off months and a war ago. I still have the recorder. I keep it in a drawer I rarely open, not because I am trying to forget what is on it, but because I no longer need to listen to remember. I know every word of it the way you know the shape of a scar, without needing to look at it to feel exactly where it is. People ask me sometimes if it was worth it. The war, the losses, the names Pierce read off the Halcyon's final roll call, the 7 from that first battle. All the names that came after that I have not had the strength to count out loud even now. I do not have a clean answer for that question, and I have stopped pretending that I do. I can tell you what became of the people who carried me through it, because that is a smaller and more honest thing to offer than an answer to a question with no clean shape. Owen stayed in the fleet long after the war ended, training new pilots in the same blunt, unhurried way he once flew a smuggler's route through enemy space, without ever once raising his voice. Grace left the service 2 years later, and now works with the new Oversight Council, the one built from species the old High Council once erased, helping them build communication standards that no single government can quietly monitor again. Noah never did stop talking to machines, low and constant, and the last I heard he was overseeing the very shipyards where the Vanguard was first welded together, teaching a new generation of engineers that a ship listens better than people think it does, if you only learn to speak to it properly. Caleb retired from active duty but never from the drills themselves, and somewhere on Earth right now he is very likely running some new recruit through the same alarm sequences he once ran us through, telling them that freezing is not a failure of character, because some lessons are worth repeating long after the war that taught them is over. Ivy Sutherland still runs her division, larger now, trusted now, and she still keeps a copy of the Mareth Vale archive in a place she has never told even me, because some truths, she says, deserve more than one keeper. And the Vanguard herself still flies, repaired and recommissioned, carrying a new crew who know her only as a name in a history file, not as the deck plating that once shook under my boots while Grace's voice held steady in my ear. What I have instead is this: A planet that is no longer young and unaware in the way it was the day I sat in that chamber watching translation lights blink over delegates who had decided, long before we arrived, exactly how this story was supposed to end. They were wrong. We did not stay silent. And somewhere out past the dark, on worlds I will likely never see myself, 11 other species who once disappeared quietly into someone else's record of natural disasters are finally being remembered by name, because a woman who took her coffee badly, with too much sugar, in a chipped mug she refused to replace, decided that some silences are worth dying to break. I carried the recorder so that hers would not be the last voice they managed to take. It was not.